So with that said, we can jump in. Probably won't get all the way through this, but that's okay. We can get a good portion of it done and talk about our next system, the muscular system. Thinking back to our first unit, when we talked about tissues, we learned that there were 4 primary tissues of the body. Okay, epithelial tissue, we talked a lot about in that tissue lecture. Connective tissue, we talked quite a bit about the various connective tissues in that lecture. And then you had muscle and nervous. And I told you guys we would spend an entire lecture talking about muscle tissue. Well, here is that lecture. It literally is called muscular tissue. Okay, so thinking back to that lecture, and really since the very first lecture of the semester, we learned that there are 3 types of muscle in the body, okay? We have skeletal muscle attached to the skeleton and all those different bones and moving those joints that we just got done talking about, okay? And that's what we'll spend the majority of this unit talking about, okay? And that'll definitely be the case for the next lecture. That's really just where we go through all the different skeletal muscles of the body. And then for the majority of this lecture as well. Okay, but then you also have cardiac muscle that's found in the walls of your heart, okay, that help us pump our blood. And then smooth muscle that's found in various internal organs. Things like our blood vessels have smooth muscle, your stomach, your intestines, the bladder, the uterus. Okay, a lot of different organs have smooth muscle that relates and functions to help move stuff along. Now, speaking of functions, okay, our muscle tissue, and this consists for all 3, or is consistent for all 3, contributes to homeostasis through sustained contraction or by alternating contractions and relaxations. Okay, 4 primary functions or key functions are provided by our 3 different types of muscle, but really the first 2 are just related to skeletal muscle. Okay, producing body movements. Okay, that's just skeletal muscle. Things like walking, running, manipulating objects. You know, writing your notes, using your pen or pencil, that's just skeletal muscle. Okay, same thing for number 2, stabilizing body positions, things like helping to maintain an erect or seated posture against the force of gravity, okay, as well as stabilizing joints, okay, like the neck muscles, keeping your head upright. That is also just strictly skeletal muscle. Number 3 relates to the other 2 types, okay, moving stuff inside the body, moving substances in the body, like our heart muscle pumping blood, moving food through the digestive tract, sperm and oocytes or egg cells through the reproductive system passages, moving of urine through the urinary system, lymph through the lymphatic system. I could list many, many more. Okay. The 4th function is a function of all 3 types, because when all 3 types contract, they produce heat. But by far and away, the majority of our muscles in the body are skeletal muscle. So when we talk about the 4th function, it really more so relates to the skeletal muscle. Okay, contracting muscles produce heat, a property known as thermogenesis, which is a big word that literally translates to mean heat producing. Thermo means heat, genesis like means to create or form. Okay, our innate ability to shiver when we get cold helps increase our heat production, and that's just where our muscles are contracting, and that causes our body to shake. But more importantly, it gives us heat. Okay. Although the bones that we just talked about provide leverage and form the framework of our body, they cannot move the body parts by themselves. Motion results from alternating contraction and relaxation, and I really should say skeletal muscles that make up about 40 to 50% of total adult body weight. Now, your muscular strength reflects the primary function of muscle, and this relates to all 3 types. Okay, the primary function of muscle is to transform chemical energy into mechanical energy to perform, to generate force, perform work, and produce movement. Okay. Once again, the three types of muscle tissue are skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Although the different types of muscular tissue share some properties, they also differ from one another in things like their microscopic anatomy, which we've talked about, like what they look like under a microscope, where they're located, and how they're controlled by our nervous and endocrine systems. Okay, on the next slide, we'll kind of see some of those differences. On the bottom of this slide, though, we can see 4 special properties that they all exhibit. Okay, so in other words, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and skeletal muscle all have these 4 special properties that enable them to function and contribute to homeostasis. Okay. First function, what we call excitability. And for those of you who are in physiology, we've talked a lot about that property. Muscles are not the only type of cell or organs that perform this or have this capability. And so what is it? It's ability to respond to stimuli by producing electrical signals known as action potentials. Okay. The other cells of our body that are really well known for their excitability are the neurons, our nerve cells, the things that like make up our brain and spinal cord. Okay. 2 types of stimuli can signal an action potential in our muscle tissue. Those that come from within the tissue itself, like in the case of the pacemaker of our heart, which our body naturally has a pacemaker. You've probably heard of somebody having an artificial pacemaker put in. We call those signals autorhythmic. Okay. Auto is a prefix that means self. So that's why it gets that name, because it's coming from within itself. When it comes to like skeletal muscles and smooth muscle, more than likely, they need to be chemically stimulated, like where neurotransmitters released by a neuron or hormones distributed are from the blood, or even just a local change to pH. Okay. Now, all 3 types of muscle, cardiac, skeletal, and smooth, once they are excited, they contract. And literally the word contract begins the word contractility. So that's the easiest way to remember it. Contractility is the ability to contract forcefully when stimulated. Okay. And when a muscle contracts, it generates tension while pulling on its attachment points. If this tension is enough to overcome the resistance of the object to be moved, muscle will shorten and movement occurs. And that's just a long-winded kind of description of physics. Okay. Effort has to be greater than resistance for motion to occur. That's not really stuff we talk about in this class. And the last 2 properties are properties that we've actually talked about before. Okay, for example, our skin exhibits both of these, and we think back to earlier in the semester when we talked about the skin. We kind of talked about how the skin's like a rubber band, and our lungs also have these same 2 properties. A rubber band has the ability to stretch. That's what extensibility is. It says stretch without being damaged. Obviously, it can't stretch forever and ever. Just like a rubber band, if you stretch it too far, it will, become damaged, and that does happen. People pull muscles and tear muscles from time to time. Okay. Once again, this is not just skeletal muscle. So, for example, the heart must stretch when it fills with blood. The stomach stretches when it fills with food. And then, like a rubber band, when you let go of it, after stretching it out, it's going to snap back to its original length and shape. And that's what elasticity is. Sometimes people call that elastic recoil because it snaps back. And so it's returning to original length and shape after contraction or extension. Okay, let's talk about the 3 types of muscle in a little bit more detail. Some of what we see here on this next slide, we've talked about before, back in that tissues lecture that I keep referencing. Okay, first type of tissue, and this is one of, like I said, we'll talk about the most at this point in the semester. Skeletal muscle gets its name because it attaches itself to our skeleton in order to move our bones and do all those different types of movements that we just got done talking about. Features of skeletal muscle: the cells are striated. Okay, and we've talked about that before, and we see the same property in cardiac muscle, and that's why if we see down here at the bottom in these illustrations, it looks like we have little bands or light dark lines going through it, kind of making it probably look a little bit blurry. When we got to see pictures of these things under a microscope, I talked about this, but this is just alternating light and dark bands or striations, only visible when you view skeletal and cardiac muscle tissue under a microscope. Okay. Later on in this lecture, I don't know if we'll get to that point today, we'll find out why skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle is striated. Okay. When we move our skeleton and we contract our muscles to do so, we do so mainly in a voluntary manner, meaning that the activity of our skeletal muscles under conscious control. Okay, when you are writing your notes, when you are contracting the muscles of your forearm, as I'm walking around the room and as I'm speaking and contracting muscles in my jaw and in my throat, okay, I'm doing so purposely. I'm not just accidentally doing those. It's not like it's doing it automatically for me. Okay, that's because what we call the somatic nervous system is controlling it. Okay, which we'll talk about the different divisions of the nervous system later on semester. Okay. Now, when it comes to skeletal muscles, they can also be controlled subconsciously to some extent. So in other words, kind of without our kind of conscious intent or awareness, like the diaphragm, which is the muscle that allows us to breathe. We can contract and relax it without our conscious control. And that's great because then we don't have to like focus on breathing all the time. Okay, we can, take over conscious control of it. Like if you want to hold your breath, like if you take a shower or something like that, that way you don't accidentally breathe in water, accidentally, drown or something like that. Okay. Skeletal muscle attaches to bone, but also in some places it attaches to our skin, what we call fascia, and even in some places it'll attach us to other muscles. Okay. Each individual muscle cell can be described as being multinucleated, which means that there are multiple nuclei per cell, and we can see this is just one cell down here at the bottom, and each of these little kind of purple blobs is the nucleus. Okay, is a nucleus, not the, because there are more than one. Okay, and each of those nuclei are pressed against the plasma membrane. Okay, cardiac muscle tissue, once again, found only in the walls of the heart, striated like skeletal muscle. Okay, a key feature that you find in cardiac muscle that you don't find in the other two, you can see these little kind of zigzag lines. Those are what we call intercalated discs, and we'll find out later on in the semester what really the importance of those are. But those are just irregular transverse thickenings of the what we call sarcolemma. Okay. Cardiac muscle, and the same thing for smooth muscle, is uninucleated. So it's like most of the cells of the body where there's just one cell and one nucleus. Okay. Unlike skeletal muscle, which is more kind of like a tube-like structure, cardiac muscle is kind of branched, and you can see those branches pretty nicely with the couple of cells that are pictured here at the bottom. Okay. Important features of cardiac muscle, and the same thing we see for smooth muscle, is that it's typically controlled involuntarily. Okay, in the case of cardiac muscle, it's strictly controlled involuntarily, meaning that we can't consciously control it. Okay, we can't just use our brain power and think right now, okay, I want to make my heart beat faster, beat slower. Okay, I can't control how hard it beats or anything like that. Okay, it's involuntarily, it's taken care of for us, because it's regulated by what we call the autonomic nervous system. Now, the wonderful thing about your heart is that it has its own built-in networking system, what we call the cardiac conduction system. And a very important component of that cardiac conduction system is what we call our pacemaker. Okay, and this is a node of tissue that creates its own nerve signal, so it doesn't necessarily need outside influence from things like the brain and spinal cord. Okay, and the tissue creates its own signal, and then that rest of the cardiac conduction system carries it throughout the rest of the heart. This built-in ability of the heart to initiate its own contraction is called autorhythmicity. Talked about that on the previous page. Okay, if the heart was just left completely alone, your heart rate would be constant at like 100 beats a minute. It would never change. Okay, well, that's obviously not the case, and that's because hormones and neurotransmitters can trigger that SA node, the pacemaker, to fire more often or less often. Okay, and we'll get into all this stuff later on in the semester. Okay, when we talk more about the heart, we'll get to that point. Smooth muscle, we see one cell down here at the bottom. It's located in the walls of hollow internal structures like our blood vessels, airways, and many organs. It's called smooth because it's going to lack the striation, so it doesn't have those light dark bands that we've seen in skeletal and cardiac muscle tissue. Like cardiac, it's uninucleated. The nucleus is located within the muscle cells. Usually is involuntary, like cardiac muscle. Important feature is that it's relatively slow moving, but fatigue resistant. So it doesn't get tired, which is great. So that, like if you're digesting a big meal, you're like your stomach, smooth muscle is not going to get tired from contracting over and over and over again. Like what happens with our skeletal muscle. When it gets tired, it doesn't work as well. Smooth muscle, we don't see that quite as much. And then just like the cardiac muscle that I just mentioned, it's also regulated by the autonomic nervous system. So like I said, we'll talk more about the nervous system divisions. That'll be our next unit. So a couple weeks away from that point. As far as the 3 pictures go, don't worry about them. Not really anything specific that I'm worried about knowing there. So just the information that I presented. Okay, what we're going to do is transition away from talking cardiac muscle and smooth muscle here for the next several slides and really key in on skeletal muscle for most of the rest of this lecture. All right, so let's talk more about skeletal muscle right now. Just beneath the skin, we previously learned we find what we call the subcutaneous layer or hypodermis, which functions to separate muscles from our skin. It is composed of areolar connective tissue and even more adipose or fat tissue. Okay, associated with the subcutaneous layer is what we call fascia or fascia, however you want to pronounce it. Fibrous, dense, irregular connective tissue that covers the entire muscle as well as lining our body walls and limbs. Okay. It allows free movement of our muscles, supports nerves, blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and fills spaces between our muscles. Okay. There are 3 layers of connective tissue that extend from the deep fascia in our subcutaneous layer and helps to strengthen our skeletal muscle. Those 3 layers are what we call the epi, the peri, and the endomysium. If we look down here in our illustration on the right, okay, we can see the epi, the peri, and the endo labeled kind of periodically. Okay, let's first talk about the epimysium. This is an overcoat of dense irregular connective tissue that surrounds the entire muscle. Okay, so this is the most superficial. Okay, it is basically kind of like the periosteum of our bone. Remember, the periosteum was that membrane that covers our bones. Well, the epimysium covers the entire muscle. Okay, it is made up of dense irregular connective tissue, so it's got collagen fibers kind of running in all different directions. Okay, deep to it in the middle is our perimysium. So this is a actually even thicker layer of dense irregular connective tissue that helps organize our muscles into bundle structures called fascicles. Okay, or muscle fascicle as it's labeled here. So surrounding one fascicle is what we call the perimysium. Okay, now a fascicle is just a collection of 10 to 100 individual muscle fibers. A muscle fiber is just another way to describe a muscle cell. Okay, so you can see each of these circular bundle structures is a fascicle, and each of these little red dots that we see here, we zoom in at one fascicle. That's what's being done down here. We can see those red dots are a lot more visible and they're a lot more complicated. We pull one out, we see one muscle fiber. Okay. Well, here, this is going to be each of these red circular structures, one muscle fiber. So one muscle fascicle is a whole bunch of muscle fibers bundled together. Okay. So that's what the perimysium does. It wraps around the fascicle. Okay. Surrounding each muscle fiber is the endomysium. The endomysium is a thin sleeve of areolar connective tissue surrounding each muscle fiber or cell. Okay. What I typically do to help keep your head straight on this and the kind of organization of skeletal muscle, I kind of create a flow chart. So I'm going to do that now. Keep your head straight on all these new terms that we're going to see. So I'll start here at the top. The largest structure is just the entire muscle itself. Okay. A skeletal muscle then can be subdivided into what we call fascicles. Okay. And we just learned fascicles are bundles of fibers. And so that's our next level. Fibers, which we commonly just will call muscle cells. So once again, surrounding the entire muscle is the epimysium. Surrounding each fascicle is the perimysium. And then surrounding the muscle fibers is the endomysium. Now, this is not complete yet. Okay, if I go back to our lecture, and what we will see is that muscle fibers have smaller structures inside of them, what we call myofibrils. Okay, so I will add those to the list. We'll find out what myofibrils do here in just a little bit. To me, the structure of skeletal muscle kind of reminds me of those little dolls that you can get. I don't know, you don't see them too much anymore, but they kind of look like Weeble Wobbles, if you know what those are. But they're the little like wooden doll things that you can open up, and inside is a smaller one, and you open it up and there's a smaller one. Okay, it's kind of that situation. Basically, you've got the whole muscle, which typically muscles kind of have this nice cylindrical shape. Not all of them do, but many of them have that kind of nice cylindrical shape. Okay, they are then subdivided into smaller cylindrical structures called fascicles. Okay, and found inside of each fascicle are cylindrical shaped cells or fibers. Okay, and then inside of those individual cells or fibers are cylindrical structures called myofibrils. Okay, so you're just kind of going down the levels of organization, finding that there's basically just like tube structures inside of tube structures inside of tube structures. Okay. Now, talking more about the epi, the peri, and the endomysium, those are all continuous with the connective tissues that attach skeletal muscle to other structures, whether that's bone or other muscle. Okay. That includes some of the things that we've previously talked about. Okay. We talked in our last unit, and as far back as just the other day when we talked about tendons, we learned that tendons are a fibrous cord of dense regular connective tissue, attaches the muscle to the periosteum of a bone. Okay. We also in our last lecture learned about tendon sheaths, okay, which enclose certain tendons like at the wrist and ankle, functioning to decrease the friction placed on that tendon with a synovial membrane. Okay. Inner layer of a tendon sheath is known as the visceral layer, attached to the inner surface of the tendon. Outer layer is a parietal layer, is attached to the bone. Between the two layers is a cavity containing a film of synovial fluid, which reduces friction as the tendons slide back and forth. And we have them at our wrist and ankle because there are so many tendons in those small areas, which we'll get to see here in our next lecture. Obviously, that won't be today, but we'll get to that point. Okay. Last structure listed here is a term you probably have never seen before. Okay, what we call an aponeurosis is a broad flat sheet of connective tissue, generally emerging with the fibrous wrappings of a muscle. Basically, an aponeurosis is kind of like a flat tendon. Okay, and We see those, for example, like on top of our head, we have connecting like the muscle that's in your forehead that you can use to like raise your eyebrows, and what we call the frontalis. And then on the back of our head is what we call the occipitalis. On the very top of our head, connecting those two muscles is what we call the epicranial aponeurosis. And we'll see that in our next lecture. Okay. Now, in our kind of bottom image where we've zoomed in on things, we can see that there is a significant blood and nerve supply to our skeletal muscles. Okay. Very well supplied are skeletal muscles with blood and nerve innervation. Okay. Generally, an artery and one or two veins accompany each nerve penetrating a skeletal muscle. The neurons that stimulate skeletal muscle to contract are called somatic motor neurons. Okay, they are neurons that have a thread-like axon extending from the brain or spinal cord to a group of skeletal muscles. Okay, those axons then typically branch many times. Each branch then extends to a different skeletal muscle fiber. Okay, we can kind of see this situation here in the bottom left illustration, kind of explaining it. We've got a couple different neurons. Okay, each of these red cylindrical shaped structures is a individual muscle fiber or cell. Okay, here's that singular axon, and then you can see the branches coming from it attach or connect to specific muscle fibers. Okay, the point where a neuron meets a fiber is called the neuromuscular junction, because that's the point where a neuron and muscle meet. Okay, that's actually what's being shown here in this picture. NMJ is short for neuromuscular junction. Okay. At the end of each neuron branch are what we call synaptic end bulbs, and then the place where those two communicate with one another, or where the neuron communicates with the muscle, is called the motor end plate. And I'm getting in the weeds here quite a bit, but I just kind of wanted to introduce that stuff to you. Now, looking down here, instead of being labeled as neurons, you can see they are labeled here as motor units. A motor unit is a nerve fiber or a neuron and all the fibers that it innervates. So in this case, it's this neuron plus these three muscle fibers, and this motor unit is this neuron plus these two muscle fibers. Generally, it can be as few as 20 muscle fibers or as many as 1,000 muscle fibers, depending on the type of control that's needed. Some places, like in our eye muscles, we need to really precisely control the movement, and we call that fine motor control. And then in other places, like in our big back and butt muscles and that kind of stuff, we have a lot more muscle fibers, and that produces more strength because they all contract at the same time, or in what we call unison. Once again, I'm kind of getting in the weeds, but that's okay. Okay, so that's the innervation. Let's talk about the blood flow. Microscopic blood capillaries are very plentiful in our muscle tissue, with each muscle fiber being in close contact with one or more capillaries. Muscle fibers are going to use a very significant amount of energy, which requires a continuous supply of oxygen and nutrients from arteries. Muscle cells also give a ton of metabolic waste off, like carbon dioxide, and depending on the type of energy we're going through, or what type of reaction we're going through, it could be creatinine, urea, can be produced and whatnot, but that has to be removed via veins. Between the arteries and veins are capillaries, which are long, winding blood vessels accommodating changes for muscle length. Okay. As far as the kind of 4 different images, I want you to highlight some stuff in this one, which is kind of a 2-part image, but here's what I want you to know. So I'll kind of just go down from the top, highlight the tendon that's labeled, since we've talked about tendons, highlight the epimysium, the perimysium, the epimysium again, the fascicle. I just don't worry about muscle fascicle, just fascicle's fine. Perimysium again, muscle fiber, and myofibril. But more importantly, you can kind of see these last few things better here when we zoom in on it down here at the bottom. Okay, so down here at the bottom in this part of the image, highlight the endomysium, the perimysium, endomysium again, myofibril, and filament at the bottom, and then on the left side, make sure you know the fascicle and the fiber. Okay, so let's talk more about muscle fibers. Is that the last blank there? SR? Is that the last one or is there one more? Oh, there's one. I knew there was somewhere. Sorry. Okay, reading through the most important components of a skeletal muscle are the muscle fibers themselves. Remember, muscle fibers are just a fancy way to describe the muscle cells. A diameter of a mature skeletal muscle fiber can range from 10 to 100 microns. Okay, what's really cool and it's kind of unique with regards to a structure of the body is that when we're born, the number of muscle fibers that's in our muscle cells is actually set. Okay, and what that means is like, you know, when you think about like your arm muscles or your leg muscles as a baby, very small. Okay, even though those muscles are very small, the number of cells or fibers that those muscles have when they're very tiny is the same as they are as adults when those muscles are big. Okay, well, that's going to mean that in order for our muscles to grow from the size where they are as a baby to where they are as adults, okay, the muscle fibers must just get bigger. Okay, that's different than what we see most organs growing. Okay, for example, bones that we just got done talking about, they grow because of cell division. Okay, where one cell becomes two cells, and that's what makes the bones grow in length and width. Okay, in our bones, that's what we call hyperplasia. And muscle cells, they undergo hypertrophy, okay, which is just an enlargement of those existing muscle fibers. Okay. Hormones like growth hormone, which tells you exactly what it helps do, and testosterone really help amplify this hypertrophy. And people can actually get synthetic growth hormone, synthetic testosterone to help boost hypertrophy. A lot of weightlifters like to do that. Okay. Men produce a lot more testosterone than women, and that's going to explain why men typically have bigger muscles than women. Okay. So that's what hypertrophy is. The exact opposite of hypertrophy is atrophy. Okay. Atrophy is where muscles will kind of shrink in size, and it's very common. Like if somebody injures a body part, like that's put in a cast. Like I talked the other day, I broke my wrist when I was in high school and spent 6 months in a cast. Took off that cast in my forearm on my left side where the cast was, looked like it was just skin and bones. And that's because all those muscles kind of shrink up. Okay, it's not like they completely dissolve, they just get smaller because muscle is kind of a use it or lose it type tissue. You don't completely lose it, but it just kind of doesn't maximize itself. It kind of shrinks up. Fortunately, with a little physical therapy and a little bit of work, you know, those muscles come back pretty easily. And, you know, that didn't take very long. Now, I mentioned earlier today that skeletal muscle fibers are multinucleated, meaning that they have multiple nuclei per single cell. And the reason is because during fetal development, these cells called myoblasts come together, they fuse. So each individual myoblast with its original nucleus is retained, and what you're left with is a long cylindrical cell with a whole bunch of nuclei. Okay. And here's what a single muscle fiber looks like. Okay, kind of opened up. Where we find the nucleus of the muscle fiber is on the outside, underneath of what we call the sarcolemma, which I'll get to in a second. Okay. Now, very closely associated with the nuclei of a cell, a muscle cell, are what we call satellite cells, which are just supporting cells that can actually help increase the number of nuclei in mature muscle fibers. And you can see one of those satellite cells. And here's another one over here in our fascicle. Each of these would be a muscle fiber, and close by are those satellite cells. Okay. Now, I just mentioned to you guys the word sarcolemma. Okay, sarcolemma is just a fancy term for something that we previously learned about. Okay, unfortunately, what you guys learned a few weeks ago when it comes to cells, all those organelles, mitochondria, plasma membrane, nucleus, okay, muscle cells have those same things. Unfortunately, some of those same things have just a different version of a name. Okay, so instead of calling it the muscle fiber plasma membrane, we will call it the sarcolemma. Okay, so in other words, the sarcolemma, which is shaded here in blue, is just a fancy term for the plasma membrane of a muscle fiber. Okay, it's that lipid bilayer with the phospholipids. We can't see them here in this picture, but that's what the sarcolemma is. Okay, and just like in neurons, which we haven't talked about, it maintains a what we call membrane potential, which we don't understand what that means in this class, but those of you in phys hopefully do. Okay. Now, in that bottom picture, connected to the sarcolemma, passing more inward into the center of the muscle fiber, are these blue tube-like structures, what we call transverse tubules, or we just call them T-tubes for short, which is what you had to fill in. Okay. The function of them is to carry an impulse, an action potential, or a nerve signal from the sarcolemma on the outside of the cell to the inner parts of the muscle fiber. Okay, so an action potential is able to spread into the center of the muscle fiber, which is very important because then that's going to help trigger the muscle fiber to contract. Okay, within the sarcolemma is what we call the sarcoplasm, which is just a fancy term for the cytoplasm of the muscle fiber. Okay, here we'll find a substantial amount of stored glycogen, which is what we use to make ATP. There's also a red colored protein called myoglobin, which binds oxygen molecules so oxygen can be released for ATP production. Okay, now you may have heard of myoglobin before. I'm sure most of you guys have heard of hemoglobin before. Okay, hemoglobin, myoglobin, I tell students just kind of think of them like cousins. Okay, hemoglobin is the reason that our blood turns red. It's what actually carries the oxygen in our blood, and the oxygen binding to hemoglobin makes it turn nice and bright red. Okay, well, myoglobin is very associated with oxygen. It binds it, as I just mentioned. But why I got to bring this up, it kind of sometimes will blow students' minds to find this information out. But when people eat steak, if they get it bloody, and I say that with air quotes, they're truly not getting it bloody. Okay, a medium rare or even a rare steak is not loaded with blood. That's not that red fluid that's you see on the plate. Instead, what it is just water from the steak. It's kind of leaked out. That's colored red because of the myoglobin inside. Okay, so if you ever hear somebody say they like their steak bloody, you can tell them that they don't know what they're talking about. Okay. Okay, on that list of structures that I was putting on that other piece of paper, I added myofibrils. Okay, myofibrils are what these cylindrical shaped structures here in this illustration are. Okay, and they are the contractile functioning structures found inside our muscle fibers. Okay, basically, I just describe them as contractile organelles. So they are the part of our muscle fiber that does the contracting, in other words. They run parallel down the length of the muscle fiber, okay? And they are the reason that skeletal muscle is striated. They have prominent striations. It's all going to relate to these, what we call filaments, thick and thin, which we'll talk about on the next slide, which we aren't going to get to today, okay? So we'll just have to wait and talk more about that next class period. Last structure of the muscle fiber I want to talk about is what we call the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is this kind of goldish yellowy colored structure on the inside of the plasma membrane. Okay, It sounds a lot like endoplasmic reticulum. If you think back, we learned about that. Remember, there was smooth and rough. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is just a fancy term for the smooth ER, the SER in our non-muscular cells. Okay. In our skeletal muscle, the SR, sarcoplasmic reticulum, it holds on to calcium and stores it. And when that action potential comes down a T-tube, which you can see on both sides of a T-tube, we find the sarcoplasmic reticulum. It triggers the release of calcium. And now those two fattened ends on both sides of a T-tube of the SR are called terminal cisterns. Okay. And so when you put those three things together, that creates what's called the triad, the T-tube on the inside and then two terminal cisterns on both sides. And without the calcium released from the SR, a muscle won't contract. And we'll find out kind of why that is in our next couple of slides. And now, as far as the pictures go, this is really cool. It's a real deal picture showing you singular muscle fiber, and they've opened it up. You can kind of see those thread-like myofibrils. Pretty neat to see. That's zoomed in under a microscope 720 times what our naked eye can see. I'm not worried about this picture or the top right picture, but I do want you to know this bottom image. And we've talked about basically everything in it. We haven't talked about what we call sarcomeres, thick, thin filaments yet, Z-discs, but that will be stuff that we do cover on the next page. And so put a star on that, highlight it, whatever you need to do, make sure you know everything, because I'd say it's all fair game for the exam. All right, we're going to stop here since we are getting up close to time. What I want to do is take that Kahoot before I set you free.